morning, everyone, and welcome to this first session, which, as Julian explained, is really going to set the basis of our discussion for the rest of the day. So it has this very broad title of Animal Welfare, Ethics and Rights. And the way in which this session is going to work is we have three speakers, each of whom is going to give a brief presentation, and then we're going to open it up to discussion from the room. So you can find the biographies of our three speakers in your programs. I'll introduce them just briefly. First of all, Dr. Sean Wensley, who is the Senior Vet for Animal Welfare and Professional Engagement at the PDSA, and of course will be familiar to many of you in the room as a past president of the BVA. Dr. Steve McCulloch, who is the Senior Lecturer in Human Animal Studies at the University of Winchester, and also the Head of Research at the Conservative Animal Welfare Foundation. And Professor Angus Nurse, who is Professor of Law and Environmental Justice at Anglian Ruskin University Law School. So as Julian said, we're going to start, I hope, with a poll for this session using Slido. So if you're all logged in to that, the question for this one, if you log on to Slido and then you put in the event code and you go to the polls and you see an opening poll, the question is, should the veterinary profession advocate for animals having a right to good welfare? Has everyone had a chance to vote? Okay, well, it's creeping up a little bit on the nose. So that seems a fairly strong opinion in the room at the moment. So let's see where we end up at by the end of our debate. Sean, I'm going to pass over to you.
Morning, thank you very much, Maddie and all of you. In our myriad relationships with animals, we humans, with our advanced capacity for morality, can apply a holy trinity of considerations. Animal welfare, ethics, and law. What is, what should be, and what must be. Animal welfare relates to animals' bodies and minds. The Useful World Organization for Animal Health's definition says that animal welfare means the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and dies. We know from our own experience that it isn't desirable to be well-fed but in pain, to be thermally and physically comfortable but anxious or depressed. Each of these areas and many more feed into our overall sense of well-being or welfare. And the same is true, of course, for non-human animals, and that's why welfare assessment frameworks, such as the 5 domains, are valuable. And animal welfare is underpinned by science. Ingenious approaches, such as consumer demand theory, pioneered by Professor Marianne Dawkins, who we'll hear from later today, condition-place preference, cognitive judgment bias, and facial expressions of pain have all helped us to take animals' perspectives. Animal behavior, as we'll hear, is both an indicator and a determinant of an animal's welfare. And the science is invaluable for guiding practical husbandry reform and for quantifying harm so that we can understand the ethical costs of current practices. So what about ethics? While animal welfare describes a state, such as frustration or contentment, it doesn't tell us whether causing or permitting that state is right or wrong, is justifiable or unjustifiable. Science tells us what is, but ethics and value judgments are required to guide us on what should be. And once a consensus ethical position has been established through democratic informed discussion, it may then come to be translated into legislation. What must be? Animal rights, what they are and whether or how they should be recognised or granted, fall within our consideration of animal ethics. An entry point to animal ethics is our recognising that animals have intrinsic value and therefore moral status. We seek to spare them from harm of whatever kind, not only because that harm might lead to disbenefits for humans, such as reduced productivity, but because causing the harm wrongs the animals themselves. And the morally relevant attribute for ascribing intrinsic value and moral status, agreed by the veterinary profession, is sentience. the simple but incredible capacity of an animal to feel things and to consciously experience feelings such as pleasure and pain. And when deciding if using sentient animals for human benefit is ethically justifiable, two dominant ethical perspectives are often presented. The animal rights-based view classically opposes animal use, advocating that animals have the right not to be exploited by humans. Whereas the animal welfare-based view, as articulated by the veterinary profession, states that it is acceptable to use animals for human benefit so long as the animals have a good life and a humane death. But could this veterinary ethical prescription actually be describing a right? The right to well-being, for example, that Stephen McCulloch has argued for. This is at least theoretically possible because there are different senses of rights. As Stephen posed in his Vet Record debate article last year, the question is not can, do, or should animals have rights. The relevant question is what sorts of rights should animals have? In the loosest sense, some propose that to say a being has rights is simply to say the being has moral status. In a second, stricter sense, to say a being has rights is to say that their interests deserve equal consideration to ours. Now, that's not to say that animals deserve the same provisions as humans, such as an opportunity to vote in elections, but that things that matter to them deserve equal consideration to things that matter to us. And in a third, still stricter sense, a right means that the interests in question must be protected, even when protecting it might be disadvantageous in other ways. However we think about improving the lives of animals, human interests typically prevail. And this habit of humans prioritizing human interests should be continually challenged. After all, if we think about equal consideration of interests approach, essentially do as you would be done by, unequal consideration can only be justified if there's a morally relevant difference between the beings in question. And when there's no such difference to justify unequal treatment, and sentience is the morally relevant capacity, then we fall foul of abominable societal ills. Abominable societal ills, such as homophobia, racism, sexism, ableism, and so the logic goes, speciesism. What's the veterinary profession's view on these matters? As Stephen McCulloch has argued, the profession has generally steered clear of rights philosophy and discourse. Our current message to the public might be, the UK veterinary profession thinks animals do not and should not have any rights. Animal rights have been equated with strong abolition-focused rights, and the notion of those rights are problematic for a profession whose legitimacy is predicated on ethical animal use. But ethical is the operative word, and the last decade has seen the profession clarifying its dual animal welfare duty. That is, to protect the welfare of animals under our care within the current status quo of animal use, as well as to collectively challenge that status quo and advocate positive change for animals at the societal level. And this broader leadership activity may benefit from invoking rights, and we see examples of leading vets advocating rights. Last year's North of Ireland Veterinary Association President, Dr. Esther Skelly-Smith, said in her inaugural speech that animals deserve to be understood and have their rights preserved and advocated for. While Emily Craven and her colleagues wrote last year in their excellent Vet Record paper that animals have a right to be free from pain, injury, and disease. Even back in 1935, pioneers such as Sir Frederick Hobday, then Principal and Dean of the Royal Veterinary College, asserted that ill animals have a moral right to proper diagnosis and treatment. Additionally, the profession has concluded, even from its typically animal welfare-based stance, abolition is sometimes required. That, quote, there is a limit to acceptable animal welfare compromises associated with each area of animal use, and if these limits are reached and cannot be adequately addressed, the veterinary profession will oppose that use or practice. So calling for abolition per se isn't a red line for us. Distinct from this philosophy, some veterinarians may be wary of the tactics associated with animal rights activism. Some feel these are emotive and alienating. Others, however, feel that rights advocates say what needs to be said. Some feel that invoking rights is unnecessary, that progress is being achieved without them, while others lament the glacial rate of that progress. Taking these points together, we've seen a step change in the profession's willingness to speak up for animal welfare over the last decade. But on some of the biggest issues of our time, we remain publicly silent. What's the UK veterinary profession's position on farrowing crates? No comment. On broiler growth rates and broiler breeder hunger? No comment. On cages for laying hens? No comment. On fatalities, use of the whip, and securing of the 3 Fs, freedom, forage, and friendship, for horses used in racing? No comment. And yet, when we come under intense public scrutiny, such as the current CMA review, there can only be one bedrock of our case, as stated by BVA in this BBC report. Vets are fundamentally motivated by animal welfare. I'm aware that veterinary policies in several of these areas are under consideration. But as Professor Nadine Dolby recently wrote, historically, veterinary medicine has tacitly and quietly accepted that animal suffering and human violence towards animals is necessary. However, more recently, societal pressure on these norms and practices has required the profession to rethink its response to how it both represents and participates in these acts. And we must continue to energetically respond, lest we leave ourselves vulnerable to the accusation of complicity with systemic animal harm, comparable to medical doctors working in the transatlantic slave trade. To close, I'd observe that the evolution of veterinary animal welfare advocacy can be considered in 3 theoretical stages. In the first stage, the veterinary profession identifies as standing shoulder to shoulder with animal-using industries, there to assist them with deriving human benefits from animals through the protection and restoration of physical health. In stage 2, as societal awareness of animal sentience grows, together with concern for humane animal treatment, the profession functions as a canary in the mine, detecting and sympathizing with this public demand for ethical treatment and identifying as advocates of animal health and well-being in order to help future-proof industries and assist them in retaining their social license to operate. In the third stage, the veterinary profession comprises a workforce that is taught and motivated to proactively challenge the status quo of animal use and shape public opinion to do the same. It identifies as a leader in protecting animals' interests in a vulnerable world with little reverence for the status quo, advocating either the purposeful reform of current practices or making organised calls for an irredeemable animal-using activity to be abolished. A question for today is whether our embracing of rights for animals will assist us in this progression. One thing I think we can say is that being able to ask and discuss this question is reflective of the maturity of the veterinary debate in the UK around animal protection, of which we can all be proud. But as we continue to progress, and as we consider our responses, we should also ask ourselves, what side of history do we want to be on? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean. And now we'll pass over to Steve McCulloch.
Thanks, Madeline, and thanks to the BVA Animal Welfare Foundation for the kind invitation to speak here today, and thanks also to Sean for the excellent introductory presentation there. So, my presentation today will closely follow an article that I wrote that was published in the Vet Record last summer called "Vets Must Be Strong Advocates for Animal Rights." We know that the fundamental role and responsibility of the veterinary profession is to protect animal welfare. And I think we all know in this room that the veterinary profession largely dismisses or rejects animal rights. And a good example of that is the BVA 2016 Animal Welfare Strategy document, Vets Speaking Up for Animal Welfare. And that was a 28-page document that covered animal welfare, ethics, duties and law, but there wasn't one single mention of rights in that document. So I'll talk today about what rights are, and I'll talk about how dismissing them essentially leads to the further oppression of animals because of the important status of rights in contemporary society. At the outset, it's worth pointing out that I'm not referring to what might be called fundamental rights, the rights to life and total liberty or against any harms. As Sean said, the veterinary profession is a service, provides a service to human society, and most in human society do consume animals. What I'm referring to is essentially welfare rights. So we could think about examples: should Frenchies have the right to be able to breathe properly, or should breeding sows have the right to have their welfare needs met and not be caged in farrowing crates, and so on. Take a moment to think about what you understand about rights, and I don't mean animal rights, I mean rights per se. I think many of us have this kind of conception about rights, that rights are there to protect us, they're there to protect our important interests, and importantly as well, when our rights are violated or infringed, we can seek recourse to justice. We can have those claims or entitlements enforced through the law, through prosecutions and through compensation. And I think most of us would agree that rights are very important. We'd much prefer to live in a world with rights than in a world without rights. And what I've just outlined there is called an interest-based theory of rights, which is defended by many moral philosophers, legal theorists, and so on. Another way to think about rights is that they act as protective fences. So you can see here the threats by the red arrows that are threatening to harm the three speakers as exemplars of intelligent primates here. And those protective barriers repel those threats, and they protect our most important interests. And just to underline the importance of rights in contemporary society, Leif Weinar writes in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that rights dominate modern understandings of what actions are permissible and which institutions are just. Rights structure the form of governments, the content of laws, and the shape of morality as many now see it. So, if the veterinary profession dismisses rights and only permits rights or grants or recognizes rights for humans, it's important to understand that human interests will always win out, because another theory within rights is that only rights trump or override rights, and most theorists understand rights in this sense. And so you have the situation without rights where animals' interests are trampled. There's no protective fence to repel those threats. So you have the highly sentient and intelligent breeding pig being kept in a cage for nearly 25% of her breeding life, unable to interact with her piglets or other sows, unable to build a nest. You have Frenchies, an extended family member, 60 to 90% of them in the UK having breathing problems. Chickens, 25% of fast-growing chickens, 250 million birds suffering from lameness. Piglets, the pigs born in those cages, 70 to 80% of them having their tails docked, a mutilation that is actually effectively prohibited under law and can only be carried out with the signature of a veterinary surgeon. So, can, should, and do animals have rights? So animals are sentient. So this follows a question that Joel Feinberg, a moral philosopher, asked. Animals are sentient. They have welfare interests. So according to the interest-based theory of rights, they can have rights. Should animals have rights? Well, humans are moral agents. Animals are sentient. Sentience grounds moral consideration. And the veterinary profession in particular has a prime fundamental responsibility to protect welfare. So of course we should grant animals rights. And do animals have rights? Because actually rights and duties are correlative. They're like two sides of the same coin. If we have a duty to meet the welfare needs of animals. Under the Animal Welfare Act, for example, animals have the correlative right, and Angus will talk more about that. So when we have rights protecting animals, it leads to the protection of their interests. The sow can move around freely, interact with piglets and other sows. The Frenchie is not bred so that she can't breathe. She can have her welfare needs met and a life worth living. What about some arguments against rights? Why might we not want to grant animals rights? Well, we could say that only rational beings have rights. So, for example, this is the will-based or the choice-based theory of rights as opposed to the interest-based theory. But if you think about it, then all babies and all human infants, severely mentally disabled people, humans in a coma and so on, won't have rights. And this is a real problem because we tend to think that rights are most important for those most vulnerable in society. What about rights being fundamental rights, the sorts of rights that Sean talked a little bit about? And this is probably why the veterinary profession has rejected rights, because in the 60s, at the beginning of the modern animal protection movement, the animal welfare community, including the veterinary profession, sought to distance itself from the abolitionist animal rights movement. But there's nothing in a concept of a right to say that a right has to be one of those fundamental rights like against being killed or having total liberty. What about rights being inviolable? This is often peddled to us actually in our ethics talks, I think, but COVID lockdown is a great lesson for rights. Our rights were taken away from us, rights of freedom of movement and association to go and visit our family. They were trumped by the greater, more important right to human health and public safety. So rights aren't inviolable. And because rights offer nothing more than duties, well, as a thought experiment, imagine if we said, well, let's say that the male vets and nurses within the profession will grant them rights and we'll use a rights-based discourse, but for the female vets and nurses in the profession, we'll just use a duties-based discourse. Now, I certainly wouldn't support that because it would lead to discrimination because of the outcomes, and that's exactly what the current situation is. So we need to reconsider rights within the veterinary profession. They're valid claims to protect important interests. The role of the veterinary profession is precisely to protect those important welfare interests. And rights are absolutely fundamental. They're the dominant legal and political discourse and concept. So we have a very problematic situation where our fundamental role is to protect animal welfare and welfare interests, but we're rejecting and dismissing the most important moral and political concept and tool to protect them. So we need to become more enlightened within the veterinary profession. We need to advocate for animal rights and engage in the debate about what sort of rights animals should have. We should use all of the ethical tools in the toolbox. And the most important tool, again, is animal rights. So we can engage in this kind of discourse. So should Frenchies, for example, have the right to breathe properly? Should breeding sows have the right not to be caged? Should all farmed animals or domesticated animals have a life worth living, a right to a life worth living? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Steve. And now over to Angus.
Okay, good. Well, I'd like to first of all say thanks for the invite to give this talk. I should also say there's a 1-hour version of this talk, so I'm going to be moving at some speed. Now I've seen the clock in front of me. Okay, so in part I'm going to pick up some of the things that Steve and Sean have talked about, and here we're talking about particularly around the legal language of rights, various types of rights that we have. how rights actually function in human society, and I'm going to be talking about how actually human rights work. Because one of the points that Steve made is about the inviolable nature of rights, and that's not quite accurate. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the unnecessary suffering principle and the duty of care. So, when we think about animal rights, we tend to use the term animal rights as if we're talking about one thing, but actually we're talking about a whole range of different things. Legal rights, rights of personhood and not to be considered a thing, which some of you will be familiar with. It's been the subject of a certain amount of litigation in America, particularly around the rights of primates not to be kept in captivity and things like that. We can talk about protection from harm, and we talk about legal protection from unnecessary suffering. So in one sense, the divide between welfare and rights is slightly artificial and doesn't actually reflect the realistic legal position. So Stephen Wise, who's an American animal rights lawyer, who's recently died, unfortunately, identifies legal rights for animals in a couple of different ways. One is around liberties, so what we might consider freedom from rights, so freedom from suffering, or freedom to exercise a particular type of individuality. Claims that Steve mentioned, which we can talk about in terms of enforcement, and that's something I'm going to talk about in a moment. Immunities, a kind of negative liberty right, so immunity from certain types of behaviour. And powers, the power to think about or enforce your rights, or to require something to be done to prevent your rights from being infringed. These can be thought about in the context of rights that animals may be said to have, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So, how do rights actually function in society? And this is taken in part through the way that we can construct rights without actually necessarily having to use the word rights or the term rights. So rights function through the imposition of duties and responsibilities. We impose certain responsibilities on public authorities, on professions, in order to consider the needs of individuals without necessarily having to use the word rights. We can put legal prohibitions in place in a lot of animal law, and I work a lot in wildlife law. The way that we construct things are in a prohibition on a certain type of activity. So you can think about things like a prohibition on using poisons, or a prohibition on causing unnecessary suffering. We also think in terms of imposing rights through the rule of law. There's a 10-minute version of that one line, which basically talks about the idea that nobody is above the law, everybody has to observe the law, and everybody should be equal before the law. Now, there's obviously a debate around whether or not that should apply to animals, but the rule of law concept, which basically talks about the fact that the law should be predictable, everybody should understand it, everybody should know the consequences if you break the law. Rights often function through application and scrutiny by the courts, and that's quite important because when we consider particularly animal rights and also the way that human rights work, it's through the way that the courts will sometimes determine whether or not a right exists, irrespective of whether or not the word rights is used in any piece of legislation or any professional code. And there are multiple examples of courts saying, actually somebody has this right, irrespective of whether or not you might think that they have that right. I'll explain that in a moment. And then also through what are called victim claims and representative claims. Now, this becomes important in a context where we might be able to say, if you are a victim of a breach of your human rights, you can bring a claim and you can take the matter to court and get some kind of relief or an adjudication. However, the way that rights are constructed means that you don't have to be able to bring that claim. Somebody can bring it on your behalf. So representative claims are relevant in a context where we might say, well, we shouldn't give animals rights because or animals don't have rights because they can't exercise those rights. But the same would be true of the mentally infirm. I don't like that phrase, but that's how it often shows up in legislation. Children, people who might be considered to not have the capacity to actually exercise their rights. We will put things in legislation to actually cover that aspect. So that can be quite important. Rights can also exist through what are called adjudicative and preemptory injunctive claims. You can sometimes go to court on behalf of the vulnerable groups and stop something from taking place. That's an injunctive claim to actually say, we want the courts to say you cannot do this. There are prohibitions on abuses of rights throughout human rights legislation, and there can be limitations on restrictions of rights. So that's a very quick explanation of the way that rights actually work in society. And when we talk about our contemporary conceptions on legal animal rights, one of the key things to think about here is both Sean and Steve sort of posed the question as to whether or not animals already have rights. I'm going to close the debate down now and say yes, they do. Legally speaking, animals already have rights. Faisal and Butler wrote a book called Animal Rights Law, which if you haven't read it, check it out, which contains some of this conception, but there's a distinction between the different types of rights that animals might be said to have. Often what we're talking about when we talk about rights is we talk about what are called thick rights. So fundamental rights that will give animals things like the right to life. But what actually exists in law are what are called thin rights, a limited and qualified form of rights, which can include things like individual animal protection, so measures that represent freedom from and claimable rights. And essentially what legal theory tends to do is to say legal duties are always correlative with rights. So if you have a legal duty of care, that amounts to rights, irrespective of whether or not you recognise it as rights. That's essentially the way the law works, although I remind you there's a 1 hour version of this talk, so I'm paraphrasing greatly. So, for example, if you think about something like the Animal Welfare Act 2006, and we think about the way in which it constructs protection of the individual animal's rights and recognition of the fact that you should consider the way the individual animal has particular needs, that's a form of thin rights. And that's one way of constructing rights, even though it might be framed in the context of what we might consider to be welfare. And this, in one sense, is how human rights work. So most human rights are qualified rights that can be interfered with. Steve mentioned the COVID situation, but throughout human rights law as it contemporarily exists, we have this notion of some rights being absolute, some rights being qualified. And when we're talking about a qualified right, we're talking about a right that can be interfered with as long as you can argue that it's necessary to do so, that it's legitimate, it's in accordance with the law, and that what you're doing is proportionate. And there are multiple grounds for interference with human rights, but broadly, they work on this basis in Europe: national security, prevention of crime or disorder, protection of public health or morals, protection of rights or others. And the way this works is that conflicting rights or conflicting interests have to be weighed up. And the courts have shown a liberal interpretation of how rights interferences can be justified. I'll probably pick this up in the discussion because I haven't got time to go into some of the cases. But essentially what happens is breaches of rights require a remedy and what's called just satisfaction, which doesn't mean that you have to prohibit the action from taking place, but it can mean you have to consider how best to redress the harm that's been caused. So to sum up in 10 seconds, a thin conception on animal rights already exists in law. And when we can look at various pieces of legislation to show that. And the Animal Rights Act shows how you can provide for individual rights by imposing a duty of animal welfare and an obligation to provide for animals' individuality. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all three of our speakers, and we can move on now to the discussion. So we're inviting questions, comments, thoughts from the room. And as we explained at the beginning, you can do that either by simply putting your hand up, in which case a roving mic will be brought to you, or by using Slido, using the questions and answers section of the Slido, and they will hopefully come up in front of me, and I can then read them out. And if you want to direct your question to a particular panel member, please make that clear. And equally, if you're speaking from within the room, could you please identify yourself at the start of your question or comment? Can I just start off with one about language for all three of you? So you all explained very clearly how you were defining rights, and you drew this differentiation between what Steve described as fundamental rights and welfare rights, which I found very helpful personally, and what you described as thick and thin rights. So, you know, all of us can understand that in the room, but when we're in the public space and people are talking about animal rights, or if we are saying, yes, vets should advocate for animal rights in the public space is generally understood in that kind of thick right term, or fundamental right terms of a right to life, a right not to be harmed, a right not to have humans interfere with non-human animal lives. So that being so, is using the term rights actually helpful, or should we, in order to be achieving what we want to achieve on the part of animals, be finding a different terminology? Do you want to start, Stephen? We can maybe work down the table.
Yeah, thanks, Madeleine. I'm actually going to question the premise, if that's okay, that the public do associate rights with fundamental rights. I think probably some of the public do. You know, I don't doubt that. Ironically, the veterinary profession and the animal welfare community has probably let that happen over the years by dismissing and rejecting rights, and, you know, helping to facilitate the idea and the concept of rights in public discourse, just meaning animal rights. But actually, you know, even if you Google animal rights or something, you know, it kind of tends to come up as, you know, it's actually to do with animal protection. It's a broader concept. You know, you see kind of hits coming up like that. I've certainly spoken to members of the public who think the term animal rights is about animal protection and not necessarily you know, fundamental rights. Although I do take your point, you know, many will think it leads to those thicker rights. But I just think the second part of answering, if I may, I think we're largely a profession of scientists. You know, we go to university for 5 years or however long, and we work in science. And I think there's a little bit of a danger of us under appreciating the importance of rights in contemporary society, and the sort of the idea that we can give up this concept and not operate and use rights discourse to actually protect animals. For me, it's kind of a bit like a surgeon trying to go into surgery without a scalpel. You know, that's how important rights are in contemporary legal and political discourse. So what we need to do is actually reframe the argument, educate the public, if you like, about what rights are, and, you know, we're absolutely able to do that.
Thank you. Anything to add, Angus and Sean?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is probably the same, although I think frequently when we're talking about the language of rights, they are spoken about, in my experiences, they're often spoken about in an absolute way. You know, human rights stop us from doing this. No, they don't. What they mean is you have to demonstrate that what you're doing is necessary, you have to demonstrate that what you're doing is proportionate. And even some rights that we would consider to be absolute, like the right to life, are routinely broken by various states. So we have cases where, for example, counter-terrorism operations have justified the use of deadly force, you know, killing terror suspects and things like that. So in one sense, the language of rights is helpful, but I think it's sometimes misleading. I think it perhaps needs to be qualified in terms of protection rather than, and this is why I said at the beginning, I think there's a kind of, the apparent binary divide between animal welfare and animal rights is slightly artificial, because when you think about the way that legal rights work, what we're really talking about is protection and remedy rather than perhaps maybe fundamental rights.
Yeah, and those qualifications and those nuances we can all understand in this room, but if we are answering the simple question, should vets be advocating for animal rights, do we not lose those nuances? We don't have any space then to explain those qualifications? Sean, do you?
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful observation and question. I guess it can work either way in the public. So in a lot of public discourse, the public will use animal welfare and animal rights interchangeably, and just the effort to improve the lot of animals can be packaged or described either way. But for others, absolutely, it's laden, and probably, as Steve is arguing, within the veterinary profession, it can be equated both with abolition and unhelpful, if not illegal, activism tactics. So I think my feeling is that as the movement towards accepting and granting some animal rights to animals globally occurs, I think there's something helpful about the veterinary profession and the veterinary nursing profession not being instantly affronted or aggrieved by that suggestion, and that an occasion like this, absolutely like this, helps to diffuse the whole thing so that we can put it on the table and consider exactly what that means and looks like. Because I think personally what I would hate is for us, having not had this discussion, to only ever equate rights with abolition and perceived unhelpful tactics, that we would then be the blocker to that global movement. Yeah. If I give one concrete example, there's one of the leading political parties in this country, in a previous manifesto, had a commitment to install an animal welfare commissioner. It doesn't matter which party, but they wanted to install an animal welfare commissioner. The children's commissioner currently, which presumably would be something comparable, is said to promote and protect the rights of children, especially the most vulnerable, and advocate for their views and interests. If an animal welfare commissioner in our country came out and said, that's our remit as well for animals, it would seem odd to me that the veterinary profession would be the first to say, nice idea, but don't forget animals don't have any rights. I mean, I'm, of course, being very hypothetical, but that would be my worry, that we're a blocker because we haven't fully considered what rights might mean.
Yeah, that is a really good point, and thank you very much. So let's open this up. I saw a roving mic going along the back there. Laura, who did Laura pass it to?
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting start to the conference. I wonder...
Sorry, can I just remind you to introduce
beg your
yourself?
pardon, Centre Car, University of Glasgow. I wonder if the expression unnecessary suffering is always a little bit of a get-out clause, and I wonder if the panel had a collective or individual sort of description of how do you define unnecessary suffering?
It's a small question for you all to answer. Who wants
I'll
to? You go ahead, yeah.
I'll go first while Steve tries to moderate his language. I think I would go back to that notion of necessary, legitimate, and proportionate. So in human rights law, we talk about the minimum interference necessary to achieve your objective. And there's, and thanks for lobbing me a bit of a softball, because I had a slide I had to cut through a bit of the material. We've got about 50 years worth of human rights case law that clarifies what we mean when we talk about necessary. And you have to demonstrate that it's necessary, not merely desirable or useful, absolutely necessary. And in effect, what the European Court of Human Rights has said, you have to demonstrate there's almost no other way you could have achieved your objective in order to be able to satisfy the definition of necessary. And policing authorities, prison authorities get hauled up for this all the time. So to me, unnecessary means you didn't have to do it, you could have done it another way, you didn't consider any option, or you didn't adequately consider all the other options, and also a question mark over whether or not what you've done is proportionate. So again, that notion of, do you have to do it in every circumstance? Do you, are there other options that you could consider? And when we're talking about animals, that might mean that something that you do for one species is not necessary for another species. So there's quite a clear way that we can think about necessary and unnecessary in rights language based on the way that human rights courts have dealt with it, although that comes with the caveat that we are talking about something slightly different here. So that would be my answer.
Steve, really quick thoughts, because I want to try and get around as
I
well.
will moderate language. I just wanted to come back, if it's okay, to respond to what you said earlier, Madeline, and link in unnecessary suffering, because another premise of what you said was the idea of the animal welfare ethic. The way that we currently treat animals in society is simple and understood by the public, and I doubt very much it is, because the animal welfare ethic is based on the unnecessary suffering principle. Sandra Kors just asked a question about that, but you know, the animal welfare ethic and the unnecessary suffering principle in themselves are probably more complex than animal rights, I would say. So to answer the question, though, you have to unpack the term, and I did this a little while ago and didn't publish it, but essentially it relates to human or animal benefit and the goods that you're getting out of it. And so some people often call the unnecessary suffering principle and the animal welfare ethic utilitarian, and we treat animals in a utilitarian way, and Peter might say this in response, I don't know, but basically we don't, in my view, actually treat animals in a utilitarian way. First of all, we have two separate principles. We treat animals in one way and then humans in another. But importantly, the necessity relates to the types of goods for humans. So, for example, trivial goods like banning circus animals could, you know, keeping circus animals, there were 20 or 30 in existence in the UK when they were banned. So from a purely overall maximizing good utilitarian point of view, probably wouldn't have been banned. So it's a good example of banning a trivial good that was seen as entertainment and not an important good. So I think the necessity is tied into fundamental or important human goods.
Great, thank you. I'm going to have one more question from the room, and then we'll go to Slido. So the roving mic I can see is down here in the front row.
Peter Sandø from University of Copenhagen. Well, I have the worry, I have a question to Steve and partly Sean, that you're abolitionists in disguise. Because, I mean, Steve's version of it, it's only about welfare, it's not about life. But there are a lot of animal uses where welfare compromise is an essential part of it. Animal experimentation. I mean, most animal experimentation will involve some degree of welfare compromise. You talked about broilers. I mean, you can go from the fast-growing broilers to those, 65 grams per day to 50 grams per day, but they still haven't got a perfect life. They're still welfare compromise. You can let the sows out, but they'll still get too many piglets. They'll still this and that. So if you go up that route, the end solution may be that, well, if you just don't want any sort of welfare compromise, we'll be left with maybe some companion animals. We can discuss that another day. But all lab animals and all farm animals will be gone. So in essence, not even without inventing anything about life, I think the logic, of this, and there are a lot of people these days who talk to like PETA, the welfare organization, they talk like, they've given up saying we should save all animals, they just take specific cases, we look for welfare. But we know the underlying vision is abolitionist. So my question to you, Steve, and partly Sean, isn't there a risk that you get on a slippery slope? That suddenly every move you take, then there'll be another welfare issue, and because some forms of animal use are inevitably bound to involve some form of welfare compromise.
Quick answers, please, because we've got a lot of questions in the room. So Steve and then Sean.
Sean's an abolitionist in disguise, but I'm not, so... Sorry, Sean, I've outed you. No.
I've got an answer to this as well. I'm going to let Sean take it.
My argument is purely formal. I just go back to what I said earlier, really, and use this metaphor that rights discourse is so fundamental at the moment. We can't just have a world where our fundamental role is to protect animal welfare, but we're not using that fundamental concept of rights. And actually, I said this several years ago. I presented in Birmingham the veterinary, the government veterinary group and the Veterinary Public Health Association. And one of the great examples of where you can imagine rights conflicting is non-stun slaughter and religious freedoms. And the veterinary, actually, if you look at the veterinary policy on it, it's really interesting because it has this line, our concern is just the animal and we're not getting involved in religion. And, if you do a little bit of ethics, you kind of look at that and think, hang on, how can you address this question properly without, thinking about religion? And the non-stunt slaughter debate is essentially about the rights of an animal to a human death versus the rights to, practice, certain aspects of religious freedom. And so I said in this meeting that, it's just peculiar to me to watch the veterinary profession dismiss rights, but at the same time, this kind of, argue in the arena of this paradigmatic liberal right, religious slaughter, and only rights trump rights. And this is why it's so important we need to start using a rights-based discourse.
Really quickly, so we have a chance for other questions.
I can, in 10 seconds, my answer would be no, because if that was the case, we would have already abolished prisons and completely abolished the death penalty.
I would say that it's not this discussion that has opened that reflection. We were already on course through not least two of the espoused veterinary principles and positions that I included. So one is that we already say if we're going to use animals, they should have a good life and a humane death in return. That is quite a radical departure from where we are currently. And we've said that we can accept the principle of abolition, and that preceded this discussion about rights. Separately, the kind of slippery slope argument I'm a little bit nervous of, again, entering the broader discourse about rights per se that appear to be a gradual process that goes from men to humans, because women are very important as well and also deserve rights, to those other marginalized groups in society. And at each step of the way, there have been these sorts of ideas that, oh, but what if we grant rights to that group? Everything unravels, and I'm wary of that.
So there's a question that kind of follows on from this, which has come up on the slide from Josh Loeb, which says, human rights may make sense because humans are one species, but when we're talking about non-human animals, there are obviously many thousands or millions of species. So does talking about animal rights make sense? Would it need to be species-specific in terms of the rights? Yeah, you go ahead.
Shall I go quickly? I think the right to equal consideration of interests partly deals with that. So as we've said, that doesn't mean that all the different species deserve equal treatment, but a dog's pain deserves equal consideration to human pain, and so on and so forth. The really important part is the extent to which animal welfare science helps us understand what different species' interests are. And of course, pain isn't the only one, it's just an easy one to describe. But I mean, when we get onto insects later and so on, it's very important to know what their interests are in order that we can give them equal consideration.
Yeah, and I was thinking that as you were speaking, because all of you base the rights really on sentience, and yet what about all those animals who may not be, or we haven't yet proved are sentient? But we're going to park that and move to Angus quickly about the human versus animal.
I was going to say, although it's not a perfect analogy, we already distinguish between different types of humans. So, you have a right to life unless we consider you to be a serial offender in some countries, in which case we consider we can take your right to life away and execute you. Like I say, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's a way that the law differentiates between
different humans.
The rights that different groups in society have.
Okay. That's great. There are two questions on the slide I want to try and kind of pull a little bit into one in the interest of time, which are, they're both talking about whether advocating for or talking about rights actually helps animals. So one point that's made is without effective enforcement, all of this is pointless and is getting effective enforcement, in fact, our biggest challenge. And I think probably all of us could say yes, that's always true as far as animal welfare goes. The other says, if a French bulldog has a right to breathe, but has severe brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome, it may have a right, but what has actually changed for that animal? How does it help?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just on the issue of enforcement, my view, and of course, causation even in science is extremely difficult to kind of evidence, as many of you will know in the room. But I can't say I have evidence of this, but if you have a broad understanding of what rights do, kind of linking up morality and the enforcement in law and the link between moral rights and legal rights, so I'm addressing the question about enforcement. To me, it's pretty obvious that if a profession and the whole animal welfare community basically dismisses rights, it's pretty obvious that this isn't the total cause of poor enforcement, but to me it's pretty obvious it's going to be a factor, right? So because rights are things that animals, that they denote important protections, those protective fences to important interests that are publicly enforceable. They're enforceable by law. So of course we need to, again, use this rights-based discourse, and it's more likely to lead to better, not perfect enforcement, but better enforcement. With the Frenchies, that's obviously a breeding issue and the generation above, so we need to draft legislation that means Frenchies are actually born with a right to breed, rather than obviously the Frenchies that are already born into that system where they can't have their welfare needs met.
Yeah, and I think I would agree. I think it's helpful to distinguish the different levels of opportunity to advocate animals' interests, and the profession has structured its approach to this whole task in that way. So we've thought about vets and nurses acting at the individual level, at the community level, and at the national and international levels. And a Frenchie that's presented to us with that condition, of course, we may consider that the dog has had their right violated, but really it's the veterinary professionals have to do their best for that animal at that time, and that stands. But if they do it without mobilizing at the national and international levels to challenge, as we are, the systemic cause of that problem, then there's an issue. And the one additional point I would link to that is when I talk about, I and others allude to complicity, when we go into the vet schools in particular and hint that veterinary students that are going to become veterinary professionals are going to become complicit with systemic animal harm, I think that's really problematic, and it has to be done very sensitively. But we also increasingly acknowledge that in this whole heady mix and complex mix, moral stress arises from these dilemmas, and they and all of us can experience moral stress from these sorts of feelings, and I think that's really important to recognize and deal with sensitively and appropriately.
Yeah, no, good point, well made. Where has our roving mic got to? Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Alice Brough. I have a question on campaigning, but I just want to first thank you for standing up for animals today. I really enjoyed your talks, and thank the person for the question on unnecessary suffering. And to quote Sean back, humans prioritising our own interests should be challenged. So I will challenge today the suffering of farmed animals, for example, and animals in testing is fundamentally unnecessary. We do not need to be using animals in society in Britain in this day and age. So I would argue that all suffering that we impose on them is unnecessary. So my question, I actually have two questions. My first question is, Sean, you said we are silent on some of the very basic horror, sort of fundamental welfare issues. And I thank you both for mentioning farrowing crates today, for example. Why do you think we are silent on that, and particularly as a profession, what are the pressures at play on keeping us kind of silent on those issues? Because I feel sometimes like I'm the only person doing it, and I know I'm not, but it's a tough job to kind of stand up and be brave about animal rights. So.
Let's let Sean answer that one first then, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Alan. By silent, I specifically meant we don't have a published veterinary policy position, so that's clear. So at the other levels, at the individual and community levels, I don't imply at all that vets and others and other veterinary professionals don't care about the welfare harms of farrowing crates. They don't advocate in their daily work. That's a given, but I'm talking about at the national public-facing level, we don't currently have a position on farrowing crates. I think one of the reasons, an underlying reason for that across the board is that it is sensitive and it is difficult, and vets can be concerned about how that public position marries to their on-farm experience and some of the problems that can create for them, and that is a perennial and a legitimate issue. But in being involved in veterinary animal welfare policy, I have seen some recurring problems. One is our historic tendency to equate welfare with physical health. So if that's the problem, then of course farrowing crates, we're not considering the mental well-being implications. Two, I've had appeals from vets to keep ethics out of this. We're a science-led organisation, we're an evidence-based organisation. Let's keep ethics out of this. That's about personal feelings and emotion. That's clearly very problematic, and hopefully we've put that to bed today. And thirdly, in considering what our legitimate role is, I talked about veterinary identity and how we identify as professionals, what our principal purpose in the world is. And some vets, I think, continue to take an industry-focused or client-focused view of what their identity and primary ethical purpose is in the world. And in that model, they promote and prioritize and defend the interests of industry, and that can also stop us from taking a view.
Great, thank you. We're sadly out of time, so I'm going to ask whether we could have the question back up, please, on the Slido, so that we can go back to that poll we had at the beginning and see whether anyone has changed their view in light of the presentations we've heard and the discussion we just had. So the question, if you remember, was, should the veterinary profession advocate for animals having a right to good welfare? And interesting that we've got some maybes crept in now. A bit fewer no's and slightly fewer yeses, I think. So it looks like a few have switched from yes to maybe. But thank you all very much to our three speakers for their contributions. The speakers will be here in the coffee break. I know there are lots of questions both in the room on Slido that we didn't get a chance to go through. So if you'd like to take the chance to come up and have a chat with them in the coffee break, please do so. And thank you very much once again to our sponsors for this session, Vet Partners.